This is my video response to the fluency article evaluation that we did. The study was exploring the relationship between cognitive characteristics and responsiveness to a Tier 3 reading fluency intervention. It's a correlational study, and I thought it was interesting because I do Tier 3 intervention, and I thought it would be interesting to see if there were any cognitive abilities that would predict how well they would do. The researchers investigated whether those cognitive abilities would affect response to intervention, and they had 3 questions. Only one of the questions was actually a question. It was which cognitive characteristics are useful in differentiating student response when students with reading fluency deficits are provided with Tier 3 deficit specific instruction. So they wanted to know which characteristics would predict response to intervention. The second question is more of a statement. Using norm reference goals, the study aimed to understand whether the data would support the continuum of severity hypothesis. And that hypothesis says that students' cognitive abilities or deficits in the cognitive abilities would mirror their deficits in reading abilities. The authors thought that the cognitive differences might not be accounted for if they received a targeted intervention. And then the third question, again, is a statement. The study sought to understand whether cognitive scores will still be associated with the student's intervention response when it's determined by relative growth in oral reading fluency scores. Again, that's kind of a yes or no outcome. So in the fall, they took 78 struggling readers. They provided a Tier 2 intervention with them using the HELPS, which stands for Helping Early Literacy with Practice Strategies. This was a small group program. And after they did that, in the winter, they assessed the students using the DIBELS oral reading fluency assessment. So 18 of those 78 students were below the DIBELS cut point. So they were the ones that got the HELPS one-on-one Tier 3 fluency intervention. Before they got the intervention, the students were all given a phonics pretest, which they all did well on. They all had adequate phonics skills. And they also did other cognitive tests. They did verbal comprehension, processing speed, working memory, executive functionings, rapid automatic naming, and orthographic processing. Those skills they thought would be related to a student's ability to read fluently. So kind of as an aside, they used a table to talk about all the different assessments they used. And at the bottom, they gave the full names for some of the test abbreviations. They only did it for 3 of them. So the 5 others, they didn't spell out what they stood for. I actually had to look up 2 of them. So just something interesting. So the students received Tier 3 intervention 3 times a week for 10 weeks in 15-minute sessions. The 8 strategies, the HELPS addresses 8 strategies, and as examples, they listed 6 of the strategies in the study. And those were repeated reading, modeling, error correction, goal setting, performance feedback, and motivational reward system. Not sure why they didn't just go ahead and throw in those other 2 strategies, but they didn't. They did post-tests using the Gray oral reading test and then the DIBELS oral reading fluency again. They wanted to see how well they responded based on cutoff scores, and they put them in categories of some response, adequate improvement, or below expectations. So what they found was 10 students had adequate response to the fluency intervention, and 8 performed below, but they found no significant effect for either adequate or insufficient response to intervention, and no significant interaction between response status and cognitive tasks. So basically, their cognitive scores did not predict their response to intervention. They did find that readers with deficits in fluency also have deficits in phonemic awareness, which I thought was interesting. RAND does not strongly predict response to fluency intervention. I would think rapid automatic naming would actually have been related, but it wasn't. And inhibition isn't useful for predicting response to intervention. And actually, these others were not found to be strong areas of weakness either. And those were verbal ability, processing speed, working memory, rapid naming, executive functioning, and receptive coding tasks. Which just kind of is counterintuitive to me. For the continuum of severity hypothesis question, they found that there was no support for that hypothesis. So no support for students' cognitive abilities mirroring their reading deficits, or at least not mirroring their fluency deficit. They also looked at the words correct per minute, the DIBELS oral reading fluency growth scores, and that was because, as we all know, one of the components of RTI is progress over time. So instead of using cutoffs, they wanted to use the growth. And they only had 2 categories for this, which were some response, if they improved by half of what the expected WCPM was, or insufficient progress. So say second graders should have made 17 words correct per minute growth in that time, and if they didn't meet half of that, then they were considered insufficient. So when analyzing relative growth, they found significant differences in the mean scores for the cognitive tasks, but they didn't find an effect for the responder group, and they didn't find an interaction between cognitive performance and response to intervention. I did find it interesting. They talked about accounting for growth, but they only had 2 categories, and their categories were some response or insufficient response. And none of the students reached the cutoff after the intervention. But they don't mention how close they got. And I would actually want to know if a student improved by 8 and they should have improved by 17. That's closer to half than if a student had only improved by 1. So I would want to know what their exact score was to see how close they got to whether they made progress, or whether they could be considered making adequate progress. One thing they found also, which was interesting, was that all the students that had deficits in fluency also had deficits in phonemic awareness. Another interesting thing, though, is that the fluency intervention did not address phonemic awareness. So I know that the study said that all the students had adequate phonics skills, so they were within 1 standard deviation of the mean, but I'm still wondering if fluency intervention was actually the right intervention. Maybe there's another lack, or another skill lacking, that was affecting their fluency. I'm wondering if their phonics skills were adequate enough. Were they sufficient to actually be able to recognize words and to actually read fast enough to have fluency? And how much did their difficulty with phonemic awareness affect their fluency? So should they have addressed some other more basic skills first before they did a fluency intervention? That's my question. So that is my evaluation, and I look forward to everyone's responses. Thanks.